Hey everyone, today I'm going to be doing a video talking about modifying your carry gun or a gun that you have specifically for personal protection. Now there's a lot of discussion out there, there's a lot of people on both sides of this discussion, whether you should or whether you shouldn't. I want to make it very clear, I am not an attorney, I don't claim to be one, I'm not trying to give you legal advice, I'm just trying to give you my own personal opinions. I highly recommend that you talk to an attorney of your own, whether you have one on retainer or someone that you can talk to, but I highly recommend talking to someone who's familiar with the laws in your specific jurisdiction to know what might be the best course of action for you. Now, I want to make also clear that if we're talking about firearms used for duty purposes, whether you be armed security or law enforcement or anything like that, any firearm provided to you by the company you work for, or a firearm that has been cleared by your company for you to use in the course of your job, make sure that before you do any modifications to that firearm, that you find out whether or not modifications are allowed, because there are going to be some companies that are not going to allow you to make any modifications whatsoever to a duty firearm, and if you do make modifications in the event of a lawsuit or anything like that, you're not going to be covered by your company's insurance. So now that I got that disclaimer out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about my philosophy as far as modifying a carry gun. In my opinion, there are things that make a carry firearm objectively better and more easy to use, whether that be ergonomics, sights, trigger, any of those things. There are things that are going to be objectively better for that firearm. Now, on the flip side of that, there are also things that are going to potentially be an enormous liability in the event of a criminal or civil lawsuit after you use that firearm to protect yourself or someone you love. Now, the first thing I want to talk about that I think makes a handgun objectively easier to use and better is something that I do to all my firearms that I carry, and that is replacing the factory sights with high quality night or high visibility sights. So for example, on my Glock 19 that I typically carry inside the waistband every single day, I have a set of Ameriglo iDot Pros. I really like having a very high visibility front sight, and with the event of low light or no light situations, I have the tritium there to give me something to look at and to find my sights in a low light, no light scenario. On my smaller handguns that I have for self-protection, for example my Glock 43 or my Smith & Wesson Shield, I have something like XS Big Dots because again I have something very easy to see that jumps out far superior than factory sights, and again I have that tritium insert there to give me low light, no light capabilities as well. Now I know from my own training that if I don't have replacement sights from the factory, for example with the Glock sights, you have the traditional dot in the middle for your front sight, and then you have that U behind it. That's a lot of white to look at, and I know for myself, again from my training that I've done, as the sun starts going down and the light gets less and less, my eyes have a much harder time focusing on that front sight. For those of you who don't know, as part of your fundamentals, you're supposed to have a hard focus on that front sight. And when you have a lot of stuff to look at in your rear sight, it makes it very difficult to focus on that front sight. That's why a lot of my friends like to have an entirely blacked out rear sight so that it's just there for reference and they can hard focus on their front sight. So something like that to me is going to make your firearm objectively better and easier to use. Also in many situations, if you have factory sights that have a no snag style where it's a smooth slope up to the top, that's going to be very difficult to use in single-handed manipulation. So that's another area, like on my Smith & Wesson Shield, why I went with the XS Big Dots, because it gave me a ledge which is going to make single-handed manipulation much better. So again, in a concrete example of why aftermarket sights might be superior and make that firearm better and easier to use. Some other things that people might want to modify in their gun, as I've done on many of mine, is ergonomic improvements, whether that be stippling on a grip that might be too slippery for you. For example, myself, any third generation Glock, I have a really hard time maintaining a very positive grip, especially as my hands get sweaty, or if there's anything on my hands that might slicken them up whatsoever, if it's raining outside. I want to make sure that I have a positive grip and positive control over that gun at any time, so I like to stipple those types of guns. There are people who like to stipple whatever gun they have, whatever texture was there before, they like to stipple it, because that's their personal preference. To me, that is something that does make that firearm better and easier to use for that specific person. There are also ergonomic things like a different type of mag release, where it's easier for them to manipulate it or make sure that they don't accidentally manipulate it. Or things like something that I do on all my Glocks is I replace the slide lock with one of the Vickers tactical slide locks from Tango Down. Now I know, again, from my own training, that doing single-handed manipulation with the factory With the factory slide lock that's on Glocks, I have a really hard time manipulating that with my thumbs. I have shorter thumbs, ladies. So because of that, I like to have a little bit more of a ledge there to help kind of give myself the added benefit of having a positive control over that slide lock if I need to lock the slide to the rear or whatever I'm doing, again, under single-handed conditions. So again, I think that's a modification that makes a gun better and easier to use. Now, one of the final things that I like to change in my carry guns, especially my Glocks, as if you've seen other videos of mine talking about my Glocks, you've undoubtedly seen the triggers that I replace them with, but I do like to replace the triggers on my factory Glocks. Now, triggers is where I think you really start getting into the slippery slope of things that can make your gun better, but also start adding to the liability factor in the event of a lawsuit or a criminal case or anything like that. Anyone who's a connoisseur of triggers out there will tell you that Glock by no means has the nicest trigger out there. Not even close. It's not a bad trigger, but it's definitely not the nicest trigger out there. And I know just from being an instructor and being an RSO in different classes, some people do struggle with heavier triggers. Now I know that Glock advertises that the weight that comes from the factory for their Glocks is around 5.5 pounds. I personally have never experienced that, at least not with my trigger pull gauge. They always seem to be a little bit heavier. So me personally, I like to bring that weight down and also have a much smoother pull. That's why I use something like OC Custom Triggers. I have a lot of videos on that. I'm not going to spend too much talking about them specifically, but I highly recommend them, so check out those videos as well. But in my opinion, that makes it so that I have a much more consistent pull every single time. I have far less travel that I have to deal with, and I can get much faster follow-up shots and shots accurately on target with an aftermarket trigger. Now the key here is I don't want to go too light with that trigger. Personally, I like to get it no less, definitely no less than something like 3.5 pounds. Anything less than that, I think you start running into trouble, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Anything above 3.5 pounds, as long as it's a reliable trigger, I personally feel is just fine for having as a duty gun or concealed carry gun or anything like that. Because 3.5 pounds, in my opinion, again, just knowing myself, is enough where that trigger is not going to be pulled to the rear until I consciously make that decision. Now, where people start to get into the negative aspects of adding a trigger to their firearm is when they start getting super crazy light or a super fancy race trigger that's not very reliable. If you have ever been to the range with your gun and while you're shooting, while you're staging that trigger or whatever you're doing, as you start to apply pressure, if that gun goes off before you intended it to, do not use that trigger for concealed carry. If your trigger is so light that you can unconsciously pull that trigger, whether you're pointing it in a safe direction or not, in my opinion, that is not a safe trigger to use for concealed carry. When you're under stress, you know, anyone who's even taken a class, the slight amount of stress that you're under in those classes, that little weight that's there becomes nothing. It becomes exceptionally easy to pull that trigger with very, very little effort. So the main reason that I think that you shouldn't have a trigger that's super light for concealed carry is in a self-defense encounter, in my opinion, a good shoot is a good shoot, regardless of what modifications you've made to your gun. If that person provided the means, opportunity, intent to cause you or someone else death or serious physical injury, and you're justified to take that shot, I don't think it should really matter what you're using to take that shot as long as it's safe and effective and you can put shots where they need to go. But let's say you have your finger on that trigger, you've staged that trigger, you're waiting for that person to make that decision of whether or not you need to pull that trigger. Are they going to move to their waist? Are they going to put their hands up? Whatever that situation is. Let's say you're just staging that trigger and you don't intend to actually pull that trigger just yet, but because you're under stress, now you've applied that little extra pressure and now you've shot that person without actually intending to. That's where I think you start running into some serious issues regarding the civil and criminal court process at that point. You should never be in a situation where that trigger is going off without you intending it to. And I think that's also where training comes into play. You should absolutely, absolutely be taking training, knowing that firearm, knowing exactly what you are going to react like under stress so that you know exactly what's going to happen in a self-defense encounter, or at least have a better idea of what's going to happen in that self-defense encounter. Now moving on from triggers, another area where I think some people might start going into the slippery slope area is when they start putting aggressive language on their firearm. So for example, there was a police officer, I believe it was in Mesa, Arizona, who was using his personal AR-15 as his duty gun. That was allowed by the police department. However, he'd made some modifications to that firearm which included changing the dust cover to a dust cover that said, and I quote, "You're fucked." Now that police officer ended up using that firearm on duty and shot and killed someone in a hotel room. Once the lawyer representing the deceased person's wife found out about that dust cover, he jumped on that immediately. And for those of you who don't know how criminal law works, you have the actus reus, the act itself, whatever the criminal act is, but then you also have the mens rea, or the mindset of the person committing that act. As an attorney defending someone whose husband just got shot by police, having an AR-15 that says "you're fucked" is an awesome opportunity for them to start attacking that mens rea, or that mindset that they had going into it. So whether or not he actually had a mindset, if he wanted to kill that person, he had sought out to kill someone with that gun, it becomes very easy for an attorney to start making that argument. And that starts tearing down his case and makes it much more difficult for him to win in a civil lawsuit or even the criminal lawsuit. Because after the footage came out, and obviously they haven't released the footage to the public, but from everyone who's seen the footage, there's some pretty sketchy stuff going on, and that's why he's now facing murder charges. Now, at the time of this filming, obviously that court case has not played itself out, so we don't know whether or not the writing on his dust cover is going to start influencing the determination of the jury and the judge for sentencing. But again, that's not something that I want to be the guinea pig for. So personally, I recommend not having any sort of aggressive language or anything like that on a gun that I know I could be using for personal protection. A lot of people like to change out the end plate on their Glocks to Punisher skulls or what have you. While I think you're probably a little bit safer on that in that area, if you know that you're going to carry it for self-defense and you know you might end up shooting someone with it, I wouldn't want to have any iconography or anything like that on my gun. Or I know a lot of people like to change out their dust covers to, there's plenty of funny things that people put on their dust covers, but again, in a civil suit, the opposing attorney might use that as arguments against you, saying that you had a mindset of someone that wanted to kill someone. You're chomping at the bit for it. So we'll see what happens with this case, and if it sets the precedent that just having aggressive language on your firearm can be used against you in a court of law. But as of right now, I don't want to be the person taking that risk. So that's why I don't put that on any of my firearms, and I recommend other people don't do it on theirs. Now, if it's something that you're just going to use at the range or something that's purely recreational, fine. Put whatever you want on it, put skulls on it, whatever you want. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I enjoy that just as much as the next guy. But if it's your primary home defense gun or something that you know you could possibly use to protect yourself, I don't want to run that risk myself. Now you might be saying, well, with aftermarket triggers or anything else like that, they could also say that you were just chopping at the bit to kill someone. Well, the difference there is no legal precedent for that. I have yet to see someone bring forth an actual court case where that was used successfully against someone to convict them, whether that be on criminal charges or even have them lose a civil case. Now, if someone does present that to me, or that does come to happen here in the future, then I might change my opinions on it. But until then, I personally have no issue modifying my triggers, modifying my grips, modifying my slide locks, or anything like that. I just don't see any issue with it. And again, I don't think there's precedent to warrant the argument that such things are a bad idea, accepting the caveats that I already mentioned about triggers. So hopefully I've kind of laid out my ideas there, why I think the way I think. If I didn't make it clear, please let me know. Honestly, the biggest thing is I highly, highly recommend, especially for concealed carriers, have some sort of legal defense already there. Have an attorney that you know, or get some sort of concealed carry insurance. There's a lot of resources through the NRA for that, so please check them out. I might put links below if I remember to. But get some sort of insurance in that area. You have homeowners insurance, you have renters insurance. It's probably a good idea to also have some sort of insurance in case you find yourself in a legal battle. Whether or not that shot was justified, whether you were cleared of criminal charges, you still might find yourself in a lengthy court case that's going to be extremely expensive, and it's good to have someone in your corner who's well-versed in that area and can make sure that they defend you to the best of their abilities. On top of that also, I highly recommend that you get training. Make sure that you, again, put yourself in stressful situations before you're actually in a real-world scenario. Make sure that you are very well-versed in how to manipulate your firearm, how to fix malfunctions, how to do single-handed manipulations. Again, that's where a lot of my modifications come in. Making sure that I can be competent and do everything I need to do with one hand or the other. And finally, I also think it's a good idea to not only listen to my opinion on this, just like anything else out there, listen to both sides of the argument. Listen to people who say you should just only run factory guns. I don't want you just living by the confirmation bias of, hey, I want a reason to modify my gun, so I'm just going to listen to the people who say that and completely ignore everyone else. Listen to both sides of the discussion, make up your mind for yourself of what seems logical and most reasonable for where you live, and then act accordingly. So again, if you have questions, comments, concerns, please throw those in the comment section below. If I forgot to mention something, please remind me. I might make a part 2 in the future if there are enough things that I feel I left out or people raise questions. But as always, I hope you're able to get something out of this video, and I really appreciate you watching.